Matthew Harrington had everything most people dream of: a penthouse overlooking the city, cars worth more than some houses, and a wardrobe tailored in Milan. At 38, he was the CEO of one of the most successful investment firms in the country, a role he had stepped into seamlessly, as expected by his parents. But there was one thing wealth couldn't buy: purpose. And for all his success, Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. The expectations had always been clear. His grandfather had built the Harrington empire from the ground up, and his parents ensured it sparkled. Their only requirement of Matthew was simple: keep the family fortune intact. Gwen, however, had wanted something different for him. Matthew stood at the back of the room, away from the hushed condolences and the formal farewells. The funeral wasn't a grand affair, but it was sincere, just like Gwen. She had been his nanny for over a decade, but to Matthew she had been much more than that. She was the one who'd taught him how to tie his shoes, who'd sneaked him cookies when he'd had a bad day, and who'd taken him to the park to play with kids his age, an experience his parents considered unnecessary. Gwen had never cared about his parents' expectations or the rules of high society. Her only rule for Matthew had been this: don't just take from the world, leave it better than you found it. The room was small, the flowers simple, the pews well-worn. Gwen wouldn't have wanted a grand affair. She'd never been one for extravagance. But as Matthew stood at the back, watching unfamiliar faces shuffle in, he couldn't help but feel that she deserved more. His father hadn't even remembered her name when Matthew brought up the funeral. Gwen, the nanny? That was years ago, Matthew. Why waste your time on this? His mother hadn't been much better. She'd waved a manicured hand as if brushing away a speck of dust. Surely there's someone else who can handle this for you. These things don't require your attention. For Gwen, love and kindness had been her riches. She had poured so much of it into him, shaping the man he had become. But now Matthew couldn't help but wonder, who had poured into her, and had he ever thanked her the way she deserved? But Gwen had left years ago, dismissed when his parents decided he didn't need her anymore. He'd always known she didn't want to go. He could still remember her quiet tears as she hugged him goodbye, promising to write, promising to stay in touch. Now, standing there, Matthew realized how much he owed her, not just for the childhood memories, but for the person he had become. And he hadn't even said goodbye properly. Later that evening, Matthew stood by the floor-to-ceiling window of his penthouse, staring out at the glittering city below. It was a view most people would envy, but to him, it felt cold, distant. The weight of Gwen's absence pressed against him. Her laughter, her stories, her unwavering belief in his potential, they were gone now, leaving a void he couldn't ignore. He thought about the life he'd built, the private jets, the charity galas, the business deals that added zeros to his fortune. He thought about his parents' pride, their satisfaction that he had fulfilled his duty to the family name. And then he thought about Gwen. She would have been proud too, but not for the same reasons. She never cared about the zeros or the sparkle. For Gwen, it had always been about kindness, love, and doing the right thing. Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that he hadn't given enough back to her. She hadn't been part of his life for years, but he owed her so much. He tried to imagine his childhood without Gwen, the quiet halls of the Harrington mansion, the dinners where his parents barely spoke to him, the weight of their expectations pressing down on him even as a child. Without Gwen, it would have been unbearable. He thought of the times Gwen had taken him to the park, sneaking out with a change of clothes so he could shed his polished shoes and expensive jackets. She'd sit on a bench, chatting with John, the ever-watchful bodyguard, while Matthew ran off to play with other children. "Go make friends, Matthew," she'd say, her voice light with encouragement. "You're a little boy, not a business deal." Matthew would glance back occasionally, watching Gwen laugh at something John said. There was a softness in her face that made her seem almost younger. As a child, Matthew used to imagine they were his parents. They looked so happy together, so ordinary. And when he lay in bed at night, staring at the vaulted ceilings of his room, he'd dream of a simpler life. A life where laughter wasn't rare, where love wasn't measured in success. He thought people were happier when they weren't rich. But life hadn't turned out that way. He had grown up, inherited the wealth, and learned to navigate the world of the elite. Yet here he was, alone in a penthouse filled with everything he thought he wanted, feeling like he had nothing at all. Gwen had always told him that wealth was a tool, not a treasure. She had taken him to the park in jeans and a t-shirt, letting him run free and make friends, things his parents had never allowed. "People matter more than money," she'd said. "Don't ever forget that." But somewhere along the way, Matthew had forgotten. He had been swept up in his parents' world, a world where success was measured in assets and acquisitions, not in laughter or love. Opening a drawer, he pulled out an old photo Gwen had given him years ago. It was a picture of the two of them at the park. He couldn't have been older than 7, his face smeared with ice cream, his arms slung around Gwen's shoulders. It was a world away from where he stood now. For the first time in years, Matthew wondered, what would Gwen think of the man he had become? And more importantly, what would she want him to do now? The next morning, Matthew found himself standing at the edge of the park Gwen had loved so much. It looked smaller than he remembered, but the sounds of children laughing, the sight of families sitting on picnic blankets, and the hum of life brought back a flood of memories. This was where Gwen had taught him to climb a tree, where she'd cheered him on as he played tag with kids whose names he'd long forgotten. It was where he'd felt free, just a boy, not an heir. He walked slowly, his polished shoes crunching against the gravel path. He'd traded his tailored suits for a simple sweater and jeans, feeling strangely out of place and yet oddly comfortable. He chose a bench near the playground, the same one Gwen used to sit on with John, the bodyguard who had become like family. As he watched the children run and laugh, a familiar ache settled in his chest. He could almost see Gwen there, waving to him with that warm, knowing smile. He allowed himself to miss her, not just as his nanny, but as the woman who had been his anchor in a world that often felt adrift. A sudden thump against his foot jolted him from his thoughts. Looking down, he saw a scuffed soccer ball resting against his shoe. Before he could react, a boy no older than 8 came running over, his curly hair bouncing as he skidded to a stop. "I'm sorry, mister," the boy said, his cheeks flushed. "I didn't mean to hit you." Matthew bent down, picking up the ball. Before he could respond, a woman came jogging toward them, her hair slightly messy, her smile bright and unbothered. "I hope he didn't hit you too hard," she said, brushing a strand of curl from her face. "Not at all," Matthew replied, amused. "Though I might need lessons if I join your game." The boy's eyes lit up. "You should play. Mom's terrible at soccer." The woman laughed. "Hey, I'm not that bad." Matthew Matthew chuckled, surprised at how natural it felt to banter with them. He hadn't felt this light in years. For the next hour, Matthew found himself doing something he hadn't done in years: playing. He chased after the ball, dodging the boys' quick moves, and even managed to score a goal or two. The woman, who introduced herself as Emma, cheered from the sidelines, her laughter infectious. It wasn't until Matthew was out of breath, leaning on his knees, that he realized how much he'd missed this, being part of something so simple, so joyful. As he looked over at Emma and the boy, who were high-fiving in celebration of a well-earned goal, a thought crossed his mind. Maybe Gwen had brought him here for a reason. After the game, the three of them sat on the grass, catching their breath. "So," Emma said, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, "do you always hang out in parks and pretend you know how to play soccer?" Matthew chuckled, the sound surprising even himself. "Not exactly. This place has history for me." She tilted her head, curious but not prying. "Well, I think you made history today. Liam doesn't usually let anyone join our games. You must have impressed him." Matthew glanced at the boy, who was busy drawing lines in the dirt with a stick. "He's got talent. Maybe he just needs the right coach." Emma's smile softened. "We'll see. He's still figuring things out. Aren't we all?" Matthew felt lighter than he had in days. He didn't know much about Emma or Liam yet, but something about their openness, their warmth, reminded him of Gwen, and of the part of himself he thought he'd lost. Matthew wondered if maybe, just maybe, there was still room in his life for more than success. Maybe there was room for connection, for joy. And as he drove away, the park shrinking in his rearview mirror, he couldn't help but smile.